1 in 3 is intended for mature audiences. Episodes contain explicit content and may be triggering as they often include violence and other varying forms of abuse such as emotional, psychological, sexual, and physical. In most cases, names have been changed to protect all involved. Please note, statements and opinions of guests do not necessarily reflect those of my own. Hi, warriors. Welcome to 1 in 3. I'm your host, Ingrid. Ken mentioned in episode 34 that the voices of domestic violence survivors are the ones that are heard. One reason is because our stories are powerful. Another reason is because we ourselves are powerful. In this episode, Danielle Patrice shows just how powerful. Here she is again with part 2.
This is why, I'm doing what I do, because I know what my children went through. I know what I went through. I work alone. I don't do this with others because at the end of the day, nobody can tell your story like you. Nobody can talk about your story and know the ins and outs of it like you can. So for me, that's what led me to wanting to understand this book or started this book, because what I did, I started advocating. I started really seeing as a survivor, when I was a victim, I was going through the lens, just going through the tunnel, the tunnel vision, and I couldn't see everything out. And then having to say everything I went through, and it's like, oh my God, I really went through this. And then advocating and start talking about it, where I've met with different, politicians, where I've met with different organizations and talked about it, but talked at different events. One of the things that I was met with, is I'm so sorry, I'm praying for you and whatnot. And that's all well and good, but that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for change. And so for me, with COVID, like everyone else being home during COVID, I ended up having to be on a quest to figure out what was going on and wanting to understand, again, like what happened to me during this relationship, because I know I'm different now. Talk about, there's some stories, you hear that, domestic violence does rewire the brain, which is true. And so that's why I went on this quest to understand what happened. That's why I have this book, Neuroscience, the Ecosystem of Domestic Violence, to do the research, to figure out that it's not just a couple. It's not just between victim and abuser. It's about that this is an entire system that's based off of beliefs, based off of generations of this, that's based off of so many things, broken systems, laws that aren't, enforced, or legislation that's not even enacted yet, that could really be, that could really help the system or help people in this situation. Because this information that, even from a neuroscience perspective, is not in the courtroom. It's not in the courtroom. And as humanistic as the legal system is, where you're dealing with all types of behaviors and personalities, could you imagine what would happen in the future if this information, this scientific information, was also in the hands of the courts, where they could honestly really, hold the abusers accountable and get the help for victims and victim defendants, and also have the abusers get help as well. Because even, we could ostracize them all the way, but what happens to people like, who are in that situation? Like mold grows. It grows in the dark. It festers. Now, don't ostracize them. Get them the help too. Because at the end of the day, they already got a new supply. And they're working up on their next victim. So that's the thing, why I want this book, talked about. I want this domestic violence awareness, not just awareness, but to change what you can't understand. So this is why this book is out here.
Yes, it's like how we mentioned before, domestic violence is multifaceted. There are so many things that play into it. And just quickly going back a little bit to your story, I jotted down a few things that sort of stuck out to me. So one, when your ex was talking about getting married early, looking back at it, it's always easier to see red flags, but that is sort of a red flag of, trying to make a commitment early on in a relationship. The other thing that you mentioned was abusers act differently when they're your friend versus being in a relationship. And I wonder if it's more of, once you become their significant other, you become their property, or they have now this control over you. So I thought that was interesting. Your family, abusers like to isolate their victims. And so they may move them away or bad talk them to family or friends or whatever. And unfortunately, your family helped with that isolation process. And then I also feel that they are really good at taking the identification of a person away. And I felt when you said you were a very strong, independent woman before this relationship, I immediately thought of myself too, same kind of situation. And just over time, it's like they dismantle every piece of you to where you're just this shell of what you used to be. And then now when you know you need to get out, you don't know where to fall back on because all of that strength disappeared somewhere. But and then the charisma that you mentioned, and I think that's one of the really difficult things for victims is when they have to go into the court system or if they have to plead their case because they've been victimized and they've been dismantled and now they are this shaky kind of a mess of a person, and you're fumbling through this story which entail could also be re-traumatizing you to a judge who gets to make their own personal decision on what happens ultimately in your situation. And then you do have, a variety of things. Could be a narcissist, could be a sociopath, could be any of those who is able to just talk through whatever they feel like they need to talk to because they don't have that empathy where they can just they can lie through everything and they don't feel like there's any kind of consequences. But anyway, those are just a few things that kind of stuck out to me that seems to be a recurring theme or a common theme within any of these domestic violence situations. But back to your book. I love that you call it an ecosystem because that's actually, it totally is. It's not just the victim. It's not just an abuser. And so can you talk a little bit about what you think is included or what you mentioned is included in the ecosystem?
So I would just want to, start off saying that, the reason why it's even called ecosystem is because it's, as you said it before, it's multifaceted, it's layered. And for me, as far as the biological term, if I'm going to talk about science, as far as the ecosystem, that goes from the atoms, the molecules, it talks about how everything is interconnected. As we talked about, how you go outside, the sun, affects you. If it's too hot outside, you have the trees. The trees, they help keep the shade. That's how things affect you in multiple ways. Even if you don't realize it, it helps. The sun helps the soil grow as much as the water, the rain. And that's what I wanted to bring a point is that everything is interconnected because you may not realize that you have an abuser that's a friend. And the thing is, if you have a friend that's an abuser and then they're shifting the narrative, you don't realize that you're an enabler. Because at the end of the day, you're sitting there defending your friend. Well, I know how my friend is. Do you really know how your friend? I know how your friend is because I'm with them. I'm married to them. I'm intimate with them. However, do you know how your friend is? You don't know them from that angle. And so that's the point is that understanding that it's so many different layers of it, that it goes from the brain. I talk about the emotions and I'm comparing it to the actual ecosystem, the brain being the atom, the emotions being the molecules, the abusers, the victims and victim defendants are the cells, and I go so forth into that, and because it's taking you step by step what every level is, because in the book, I don't call it chapters, I call it levels. And so you're understanding this is what's happening on this particular level. This is what's happening on the tissue level. This is what happened at the community level. This is what's happening on the politics level, the entertainment industry level. This is what's happening on the societal level. And what that's doing is making you understand that this is so much bigger than, that those neighbors that are arguing. This is so much bigger than, why can't my sister and their boyfriend get along? This is so much bigger than that. And when people start to understand that everybody plays a role in this. But what role do you play in the person's life when you're being victimized? What role do you play when you're, the abuser and you're not helping the victim or you're coinciding with the abuser? One of the things that I talk about is that in the book is, in my opinion, I think that some of these enablers need to be arrested because at the end of the day, if there was a murder, you would be an accessory during the fact and after. So what do you think is happening beforehand? There's abuse happening. And there's people who are also coinciding knowingly and willingly participating in this situation because the abuser is different. So I think it's just, a lot of things that's happening in these circumstances. And not to mention, there's a scientist, I want to say her name is Jennifer Freud, and her work is amazing as well. And I talk about it where it's called betrayal trauma, where the victims are experiencing that, where it's experiencing the betrayal of someone that they once trusted. So this is a complicated situation. You have people that, still feel betrayed because, this person they know still owes them $5. Well, what do you think this person is saying? Hey, I'm never going to do it again. I'm never going to do it again. And then betrays their trust over and over and over again. Someone that they once trusted. That's something that needs to be discussed. That's something that needs to be looked into. There's another term, DARVO, deny, attack, reverse victim offender. And that's what I mean when they're saying they're shifting the narrative. So I think that with all of these things, that's part of understanding the ecosystem. A lot of people like to talk about the gaslighting or, the new buzzwords now, but we really need to understand domestic violence as a whole piece of this whole entire situation. And let's break it down layer by layer and to see why is it so effective? Why is it 1 in 3? And I say 1 in 3 women, this is more so as the victims are women, not abusers. But I mean, let's just say I know men are victims as well, but mine is geared towards women victims, and male abusers, just to be clear. But why are there 1 in 3 women being abused? Why is this an epidemic, not just in this country, but in almost every country? Why is this a continued situation of happening? Why is it that the government, the legal system, things of this sort, why aren't they able to tackle this on and really put a stop to it, eradicate this, especially when there's budgets being cut? People are falling through the cracks. People don't know, how to really combat, domestic violence. So, it's for this book, it's really to understand this is part of the entire ecosystem. Everything I'm talking about is part of the entire ecosystem. How does it affect you? Because you may not care about me, personally, it's like, that's her business. But you know what? You have daughters, you have wives, you have sisters, you have nieces, cousins, friends. You have all of those people who may have been already victims or may be victims, in the future. And you have to figure out, understand what is going on in these type of situations and not understand like why, when I try to pull you out of it, you're going back to him. Why are you staying with him? He's abusing. You have to understand the dynamics of that. And that's why I call this the ecosystem of domestic violence.
Which I think is absolutely brilliant, because when people talk about domestic violence, they're like, oh, we need to do something about it. But it just seems it's such a cumbersome thing when you look at it as a whole. Like, what can you really do? But when you break it into how you describe the ecosystem, then it's manageable. Then you can provide education for society on what they can do as a bystander or a witness. And statistically, somebody close to them is going to be a victim of domestic violence at some point in their life. So yeah, I love that you describe it as an ecosystem, because it makes it, like I said, it makes it more manageable. You can attack it from different angles. It's like this massive beast, and you just can come at it from all different points. And then do you want to talk a little bit about the neuroscience part, which I thought, of course, medical nerd, I thought was so cool.
Well, one of the things that, I'll say talking about it is that there's a portion of the brain called the limbic system. And what that does, it regulates the emotion. And if there's any sort of dysregulation, it does make that person unstable. And one of the things that, in the brain, which consists of, the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and so forth. But there's a portion in the amygdala that's very vital, because it does also have the moral decision or capability to make the moral decision to hurt or harm someone else. And so if that's one of the things that I thought that was very fascinating, that in this brain, because the brain is like it's like an engine in a car. The engine goes, the car don't move. Same thing with the brain. The brain, is designed to everything in real time to handle things, and also handle things. And I want to say, as far as talking about even the hormones, it's not just with seconds, but it can go throughout years, and that's all with the brain, with the chemicals and whatnot. But anyway, kind of going back onto the brain, there's also something called the prefrontal cortex, which is in front the front portion of the brain. And if that part is damaged in any way, shape, or form, then, that person has a potential to be more volatile. So, that's some of the things that, I picked up learning, as well. Now going back, like I said, I talked about, the thalamus and, or not thalamus, sorry, the hormones. And the hormones, they release a lot of chemicals, and some of that's called neurochemicals as well. And one of those is, the cortisol, that is also connected to or in connection with chronic stress from being in an abusive situation. And not to mention, the I don't get oxytocin. Anyway, it's, that is also what they call, that's I don't want to say the love drug, but the love chemical that also bonds somebody to another person. And so that also plays a role in that as well. That's as I talked about that in the book, but, and it plays a role even with the trauma bonding, not to mention, but the one most important thing I want to also say is that even with the, in returns, if someone left the restraint, like left the abuser, not only in years, your psychological, or not psychological, your physiological makeup, your profile makes you a decade older. I'm in my 30s, but my body could say I'm in my 40s by being in a situation. Your body, it's channeling all of that chronic stress. It's channeling all of that, which can make, it can damage your body. It can cause a lot of, stress and disease in your body, like that dis-ease. It can cause like a heart disease. It can causes a lot of problems within your body to go through being in this situation. It's deeper than just, this person is saying, I don't like you. It has a full on, I would say a full on attack on your body, a full on attack on your brain. It is a full on attack on you spiritually, it's a full on attack on you, the whole nine. And so, with that said, I feel like with the brain, it is very important to understand how powerful the brain truly is, how very complicated because it is a complicated organ. Like I said, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I am giving you certain points. But I feel that what's important is that you have to understand the dynamic of the brain with even with the neurochemicals, because the dopamine, that's the rewarding, that plays a role in that. The bottom line is just that the fact that the brain it's very important to understand that the brain is a very complicated organ, and what it does, it can rewire your brain. Not only in that situation, you also understand the abuser, because and even there's you see what the brain looks like in the ridges. There's ridges in your brain, and what that does is, if this consists of like white and gray matter, and if that gray matter dissipates, if it's pretty much reduced, that also leads to schizophrenia. That also leads to some sort of mental health or mental illness. And it's not as fully, in my opinion, I don't think it's fully discussed how important the brain is. We have heart health, we have, lung health and all of these things, but in reproductive health, but I don't see as much with brain health. And that's just my opinion. And I think it's very important to understand that, because the brain is very much impacted just as much as your body when it comes to domestic violence.
Absolutely. And like you said, the brain it's the control center. And
yes,
you mentioned earlier how things can become rewired. It can become rewired to where then your body will have reactions. And you also mentioned triggers that can happen, later in life, where all of a sudden you're experiencing physically something that's going on, and you don't understand why, but it's somewhere in that neural pathway, your brain saw something that was familiar and brought you back to that traumatic event. And now you're having this reaction to it. You also, in the book, you mentioned like Pavlov.
Yes.
And
yes.
And I think that has a lot to do with it too, where all of a sudden you start to learn to associate certain experiences, sounds, whatever, with something else, and perhaps develop a fear for it, develop a connection to it.
And and I'm glad you brought up Pavlov's dog, because I did not mention that. But yes, because that's the other thing, talking about behavior conditioning as well. And the thing is that for those who may not be familiar with Pavlov's dogs, Ivan Pavlov, he did a study, I'm going to say with early 1920s, or not 1920s, I want to say early 1900s, definitely. But what he did was he would have a bell with his dog, and the dog correlated the bell along with getting food. And when he didn't ring the bell, he had the food out the same time. But when he had the bell, the dogs would come and get the food. But when he didn't ring the bell, the dogs wouldn't move because they thought that, they're waiting for the bell. And so that's just a way of conditioning someone, even when you compare it to domestic violence, it's the same thing. They're grooming them. They're, brainwashing to become this puppet of them and of themselves. So it's, that's one of the things I did in contrast. The same thing is fear conditioning, what I talked about with in the book with baby Albert. With that story is that, now that one was definitely the 1920s. And that's unfortunately that study was never finished because the baby was like at least 9 months and the mother was like so concerned, like, no, I don't want him, in this study anymore. But the thing was, it was the scientists, what they were doing was they were having this baby who had no fears, no phobias or whatnot. And they were creating phobias, they were like with certain objects. And what that was it was an object like a bunny rabbit, a white bunny rabbit. And once he grabbed the white bunny rabbit, then they put on a loud noise and made him cry. And they would do this over and over again. And then he developed a phobia of this bunny because it was associated with, making this loud noise. And so that's fear conditioning. And that's part of the things that, I talked about. And that's how they're doing this, associating us with certain things. Like you think about it as a survivor, you have certain memories that are, that may be triggered by maybe what you're watching, triggered by what you're eating, maybe a certain place where you go to, it may be triggering for you. And that's because of the fear conditioning that has been, been placed upon you with this particular abuser. So I think that, even though these are separate studies, completely separate studies for a completely different reason, it all goes back to domestic violence at the same point. It all talks about it relates to domestic violence because these are the tactics that abusers use. And I think that that's very important to understand that this is what it looks like being in these situations because it's a bunch of tactics. It's manipulation. It's constant lying. It's constant, it's always something, whether they're denying constantly things, whether they're hot and cold, whether they're abusive. It's like you said earlier, they're breaking you down to the point where you are less of a person, where you are nothing but a shell. And they're able to exploit you, to control you, to whatever they want to you, unless, when you're ready to leave, then they try to kill you. So, these are the kind of things that it is so important that even though, again, these are different studies for totally different reasons, they still go back and relate to domestic violence.
Absolutely. And I think the victims then, and who then become survivors, and when they find a healthy relationship, even though that individual may be exactly the most perfect, well, there's no such thing as a perfect person, but
right.
A stable, healthy, mentally normal individual, they can still do regular behavior that may trigger that survivor to revert back to all of a sudden having this fear or uncertainty of what's happening, and may lose faith in this person or trust in that person.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And that's the thing. That's just it's a very scary situation to be in for anybody.
And I don't want to make it, now we're making it sound very hopeless. So it's not necessarily hopeless, because even though your neurons, your neural pathways may be rewired, there are ways to work through that and to become someone who can trust or love someone again or feel comfortable. Or you may still have these buried triggers that you don't even know are there, but there are different things that you can do to become, be able to go out in society again and not be fearful of everything.
Right. But I do want to say that it's not about being hopeless. It's about, this is the real situation. And the thing is that, a lot of people want to, try to make it so light. And the thing is that this is the problem is that we have to say exactly what it is. Yeah, there are times you're going to feel hopeless. You're going to feel powerless. But you also have to have, when you're ready, you will, and that, your soul is going to, enough's enough. You're going to get there, and you're going to get to that point where it's like, I'm going to fight through this. But you also have to understand this is what happens in these type of situations. And I've done different, like a lot of podcasts where I've talked about, people are talking about how, they want it lighter. And the thing is that's why it's not getting resolved, because until you go through the darkness, you cannot get to the light. You have to go into the depth of it. And that's the whole point. It is there were years before COVID where I felt trapped and felt hopeless and not knowing how to get out of it. But the fact that I am out of it, and you're right that, there are different neural pathways that can help you with getting into a better situation. And, the brain is plastic. So as a plasticity that it can help you, getting out of the traumatic, I don't want to say phase, but getting out of the trauma, getting yourself out of that. So it's not that it's impossible, but it's the fact that we got to get there and see that and have the correct research out there to get us to that point.
Absolutely. And knowledge is power. So you need to know what's happening to be able to develop the strength to get yourself to propel forward. Okay. Is there anything else I know, like I said, I don't want to talk totally about the book because I want people to be able to read through it too, because it's great information. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on with the book?
No, I just want, okay. I hope people can, you can get on Amazon, you can get on Barnes and Nobles. And, I just want to thank you for listening. And just really, I really appreciate being on the show today.
Oh, I'm so happy you came on the show. This is wonderful. And we're going to, you'll have a bio that will be linked to this episode. So if people want to find the book, they should be able to just click on that and it will take them to where they can buy the book. Is there anything, so I guess it's sort of the same question, but worded maybe two different ways. Is there anything that you would feel like you'd like to tell somebody who's actively in a relationship, or is there something that you know now? Well, there's a lot of things you know now that you wish you could tell your previous self, I'm sure. But is there anything that really sticks out in your mind?
I think for anyone that's in a current situation, the one thing you have to do is document and finding ways to have your documentation. You got to send it to yourself. If you got to, trust someone with your documents, do what you have to do. Make sure you have to, you have all your ducks in a row. And the reason why is because, when you go through that courtroom, you have to overprove. When you go to the police station, you're going to have to overprove that you are a victim in a situation. And, you may not know how to, converse or conduct yourself because you're flustered, because you're in this situation that you're trying to get out of. You're frustrated. But at the same time, let your papers, let your documentation be your guide, and let them talk for you. That's perfect advice. Okay. So incredible story, incredible amount of work and research into this book. And I think it's going to prove to be very helpful for not just victims, not just survivors, but any advocates, anybody who really wants to make a difference in the world of domestic violence. So I'm so happy. I'm so appreciative for you to come on today and share all of this information with us. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. There are so many things I love about this. Danielle transferred her trauma into strength to help others. She took to educating herself on neuroscience and relating it to the behaviors and thinking of domestic violence victims and abusers. The link to her bio is included in today's notes, which will lead you to her socials and where you can purchase her book, Neuroscience, The Ecosystem of Domestic Violence. As always, thank you for listening. I will be back next week with another story for you. Until then, stay strong, and wherever you are in your journey, always remember you are not alone. Find more information, register as a guest, or leave a review by going to the website 1in3podcast.com. That's the number 1, IN, the number 3, podcast.com. Follow 1in3 on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at 1in3podcast. To help me out, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe. 1in3 is a .5 Pinoy production. Music written and performed by Tim Crow.